My name is Brian Fox Ellis with the Illinois Audubon Society, and we are helping Will County Audubon host a wonderful program. You'll get a more formal introduction in a moment, but I will say I've heard Matt Hayes speak several times. It's like your favorite college professor that you take classes with, even if it doesn't fit your major, because you know you're going to learn something and enjoy it. My job tonight is just to remind you of a couple housekeeping things. Please keep yourself muted. We will mute you if we need to, but it's best if you do it. We don't need to hear your dogs barking. And you can choose whether or not to have your camera on. If you have any questions, type them in the chat. And I will be monitoring the questions, but in the chat, not the Q&A. And I will read the questions at the end because we often get like 3 or 4 questions that are similar. So I might put those together. And now I'd like to turn it over to Greg from Will County Audubon.
So a couple of items that I'd like to bring to your attention before we get to the main feature. There is a drawing tonight for 2 $25 gift cards that were generously donated by Wild Birds Unlimited and Joliet. So thank you to the Wild Birds gang. And for those of you who are joining us and are not normally with us on these programs, we're happy that you're here with us. And just to let you know, our March program is in person at our normal spot in Pilcher Park Nature Center. And it is an Optics Planet produced optics fair for all of us who attend. It is given by Stephen Ledden, who's the Director of Product Intelligence, and he'll be bringing a lot of cool optics for us to fondle. And we'll be reviewing some of the basics of optics, what the numbers mean on our binoculars and spotting scopes, and is a fountain of knowledge about optics. So there will be a big Q&A session after that. So on to our main feature. Matt Hayes will be giving us a program on whooping cranes. He has worked with birds and other wildlife for over 20 years. He earned his Bachelor of Science in Zoology from Eastern Illinois University in 1998, Master's in Biology from the University of South Dakota in 2005, and his PhD in Animal Sciences from the University of Wisconsin at Madison in 2015. His research for both master's and doctorate degrees focused on sandhill crane behavior and population demography using observations of banded cranes and genetic analysis. He has also assisted in research on piping plovers in South Dakota and songbirds in Wisconsin and Illinois. He is currently the assistant director at Illinois Audubon Society, and I'm very much looking forward to his program. Please join me in welcoming Matt Hayes.
Great. Thank you so much, Greg. I really appreciate that. Welcome, everybody. I'm really happy that you guys all tuned in tonight. This is the first time I've done this particular program, so if there's any kinks, we'll work through them. And but if you've seen my Sandhill Crane program, I have done that a couple of times. It's going to sound kind of similar right at the beginning, but don't fret, because it's going to veer pretty quickly into whooping cranes. And we'll get some information about those guys. So let me get my screen shared here. Sorry, give me 1 second here. Okay. All right, so we're going to talk about whooping cranes here in North America. What do we know about the past, and how things changed over time? What's currently going on in terms of whooping crane conservation, and what might happen in the future, which is always hard to tell, but there's some potential ideas about how we can maybe move whooping crane conservation forward into the future. So I like to start with this slide because it shows all 15 species of cranes. They do have a worldwide distribution, and they're found everywhere except for Antarctica and, surprisingly, South America. They're found on the remaining 5 continents. And you can see there's quite a bit of diversity in terms of how cranes appear. Everything from the golden crowned crane feathers in the upper left for the black crowned and the gray crowned cranes, to the ones that have a lot more red present on their head. And you will see that most of the crane species do have red on their head somewhere, and red is a really important kind of signaling color for cranes. And so, as I kind of mentioned, cranes are found worldwide. You can see the distribution of the different crane species across the different continents. And, cranes are very large, they're very showy. If you've ever been near a crane when it has suddenly started to call, they're also quite loud. It's been kind of hypothesized or suspected that, you can hear crane calls for miles when they're calling in the open area. And so we often will revere cranes. If you look at a variety of different cultures, a lot of them have myths or stories surrounding cranes. They make their way into our art. They tend to permeate our lives. And I think that there's something about how cranes behave and how humans behave and how we can see similarities amongst each other. And even as much as we tend to revere cranes, 10 out of the 15 crane species are threatened or endangered, either here in the United States or on a global scale. And so even though we tend to revere the cranes, we tend to appreciate them, we as humans are causing endangerment and threatening some of the viability of some of these crane species. So this particular talk, I'm going to be focusing here on the whooping crane. You can see here this guy on the far left, and kind of points to some of the distribution here in North America. So whooping cranes have the scientific name Grus americana. And I was always really interested in this when I started learning about cranes, because the current population of whooping cranes breeds in Canada. They winter in Texas. And I always thought it was really odd that it was, Grus americana compared to Grus canadensis, which is the sandhill crane. And I was like, well, whooping cranes don't even really breed in America, the United States of America currently. And the more I learned about them, the more I'm kind of just fascinated with how whooping cranes ended up being named Grus americana and sandhill cranes being named Grus canadensis. Whooping cranes are the tallest flying bird in North America. They do stand about 5 foot tall, and their wing span is about 7 to 8 feet wide. And so they are a large bird. They're very showy. They're very loud, but they're also endangered. In terms of crane species, they do have the smallest population size of all crane species currently extant in the world. They are wetland dependent year round, so they use wetlands for breeding. They use wetlands for roosting at night. They use wetlands primarily during migration when they need to stop over. And then they use a lot of wetlands during the winter as well. And so they're highly dependent on wetlands, and we'll see that it's not necessarily a certain wetland type that they need, but or a wetland size either, but it's the productivity of what's going on in the wetland that's really, really important. They do show strong territoriality, so they have a breeding for breeding pairs. They have a breeding territory they defend from other cranes, other whooping cranes, sandhill cranes, other species. But many pairs also have territories on the wintering grounds. And there's a lot of different hypotheses about why they're territorial during the winter as well. In addition to being territorial, they also have strong site fidelity, which means that they return to those same sites year after year after year. So conserving those is critically important. They do have long-term pair bonds. It's not uncommon to have a pair bond that is easily 15, 20, 25 years long. And they do have low chick production and low fledging. So only about 20 to 30% of chicks will fledge, which means they survive to flying and will likely make it to their first year of independence. And so they're kind of a classic species that has high adult survival, lower chick survival with that long lifespan. Historically, whooping cranes had a much wider distribution than they do currently. These are the different states where fossils of whooping cranes have been located. They think whooping cranes might have had their highest distribution in the early Pleistocene, which was about 3.5 million years ago, till about 10 to 15,000 years ago, the kind of end of the last ice age. But you can see that they were found basically continent-wide, at least in the lower 48 United States. In addition to fossil finds, we also see that there's a lot of reference to whooping cranes in a lot of Native American culture, in a lot of Native American sites. You can see that there's painted whooping cranes on murals at Pottery Mound in New Mexico. The name Aztlan, which was a place or where the Aztec culture, the Aztec peoples kind of descended from, and it tends to refer to the place of the crane or the place of whiteness in terms of a white crane. In Tepanek, it means the people of the crane. Coastal areas in Tamaulipas, which is just south of the Texas border. Viejo del Agua, which means old man of the water. Gruya Blanca means white crane. And so these tend to kind of tie in to referring to whooping cranes, which historically lived in and around those areas. And so we've got some other ones like the DeSoto Chronicles in Florida, the Coronado Expedition into New Mexico, other areas which refer to cranes in kind of in a more general sense. But definitely there are references to whooping cranes found in a variety of different areas. And real quick, I just want to acknowledge Ruth Partida Lara and Siux Diaz Gomez. They were interns at the International Crane Foundation, where I worked a long time ago. And they did a lot of this research, kind of digging into historic Native American as well as Mexican and Spanish literature to try and dig some of these references out. So enter Robert Porter Allen. He was a key founder of whooping crane conservation. He intensely studied whooping cranes on the wintering grounds in Texas. He wanted to understand more about their behavior, about their habitat use to aid in their conservation. In addition to whooping cranes, he was also very instrumental in leading conservation of American flamingos and roseate spoonbills. This would have been in the early half of the 20th century. In 1952, Allen published a monograph called The Whooping Crane in conjunction with the National Audubon Society. And in this monograph, he collected all the known information about whooping cranes at that time. And so this came out in the 1950s. And when this publication came out, they didn't even know where the current breeding grounds of whooping cranes were located at. They knew that there were birds wintering on the Gulf Coast of Texas. They flew north every year, disappeared, and reappeared every late fall to the Gulf Coast of Texas. And it wasn't until 1956 when the breeding grounds were actually discovered up in Wood Buffalo National Park. And I'll talk more about that in just a bit. But as I kind of mentioned, Allen it was the culmination of some of his life's work. And he included a lot of information about historic observations of whooping cranes. And he put these together and he created this map. And this is kind of a quintessential map of the historic range of whooping cranes. And if you kind of see here this dark kind of weird polygon line that shows up kind of right in the middle of North America, he put his observations together, and this is what he considered to be the core breeding area for whooping cranes prior to the early 1900s. There were a couple of scattered wintering areas, like here in New Jersey, along the Carolina coast, down into the Louisiana and Texas Gulf Coast, and then also the highlands of Mexico. And then you can see some of these kind of errant dots, which are observations which didn't necessarily cluster together with some other observations, and so he included them. But what's real interesting is when you compare the map and the information that he put together for the range, it doesn't necessarily fit with all the observations that were listed in his monograph. And so I worked with Jane Austen, who is retired U.S. Geological Survey, as well as Joe Barzin, who was my boss at the International Crane Foundation at the time. And we put together this book chapter, kind of reinvestigating Allen's work. And we put all of his observations into a kind of a geo-referenced ArcGIS layer. We included all his observations, as well as observations that were published after Allen's 1952 monograph. And so we put all these together into kind of a digital mapping system, and then also conducted some habitat analysis. And so you can kind of see it's a little challenging. This is a little bit far away, but I will zoom in on some of these areas in just a bit. But a lot of the green dots are all known nest locations. So here we've got Allen's original range in red. And you can see most of the green dots fit within that kind of red polygon that starts here in Alberta, goes southeast, and ends kind of in Illinois. But you can see that there are also green dots that are outside of this polygon. And so we wanted to try to investigate this a little bit further and see how we might be able to appreciate whooping cranes just a little bit more. So let's zoom in here on the breeding areas. And so you can kind of see those green dots a little bit better. And so what's really kind of interesting is that when you look at the areas where whooping cranes used, they varied greatly from, high Canadian forest up into the Slave Lake forest areas here. This is Slave Lake, which is just outside of the polygon, down into aspen forest and parkland, into the upper grassland areas of the tallgrass prairie, shortgrass prairie, and into the transition zone in southern Minnesota, southwestern Wisconsin, and northern Illinois. And so this is important because when people started to talk about possible whooping crane introduction areas, they focused so much on areas in wood buffalo. What is it like in wood buffalo? Are the areas we're looking at similar to wood buffalo? And yet historically, whooping cranes nested in such a wide variety of different habitats. The core area was found in what's known as the prairie pothole region. And so you can kind of imagine that red polygon line fits almost perfectly within this green blob of the prairie pothole region. And so the core area, the whooping cranes clearly were settled into this prairie pothole region as a main source of nesting habitat. And when you look at the prairie pothole region, they're not huge, large wetlands. These are very small, very densely packed wetland areas that were carved out as the glaciers receded 10 to 15,000 years ago. So the glaciers kind of carved these little spots out into these wetland areas. Some of them are relatively deep, some of them are relatively shallow, but they kind of pockmark the entire landscape. So these are not large continuous wetland areas, but small concentrated wetland areas intermixed with tall grass and mixed grass and short grass prairie areas. This is the core. This is where whooping cranes were historically centered. This was their main habitat area. In addition to this area, they also nested in these taiga boreal forest wetlands. Wood Buffalo National Park is littered with these, and this is the current nesting population for the last remnant population of whooping cranes. In addition, there were also non-migratory populations along, along the Gulf Coast. And these were all freshwater wetlands that were separated from the marine salt marsh. Very different wetland types, but all highly productive wetlands, which we think were really important, not only for adult survival, but also for growing chicks and also making sure those chicks survived. Excuse me. I have a frog in my throat. I'm just going to wait a second here. Okay, so those are the breeding areas. We look at the wintering areas. And so I kind of mentioned they were intermixed in a variety of different spots. It's a little bit cut off on this map, but was a small population that wintered in Egg Harbor up in New Jersey. You've got wintering populations here along the coast of the Carolinas. Large number of population of birds that were located in southwest Louisiana, along the Gulf Coast of Texas, and in northeastern Tamaulipas, Mexico, and then also into the highlands area. And so these are all very different wetland types. And when you look at these different winter habitat areas, you can see you can kind of divide them into two main different types. You've got marine salt marsh, but even then with marine salt marsh, it varies greatly between those in Cape May, those in the Carolinas, and then in the Gulf of Mexico, very different vegetation types. You've got dominant grasses, everything from spartina to different rushes, all very different, but all highly productive. And these were really important for winter survival, not only for continuing chicks to grow, starting to become independent, but also for adult birds as they're getting ready to migrate back and start the next nesting season. In addition to these marine salt marshes, you've also got high plateau desert freshwater marshes, which include areas like Lago de Chapala in Mexico and Balsam de Mapimi. Also, very different wetland types. These were very large, very flat, oftentimes went through boom and bust drought cycles, but again, very highly productive. And it's interesting is that Allen and others have actually hypothesized that this area may have served as probably one of the larger wintering areas for whooping cranes in general. And then we'll look at the non-migratory breeding and wintering habitat here in southwestern Louisiana. This is a map from Allen, and he said that a lot of the areas that were freshwater prairie, kind of north of the salt marsh, these were the areas that were used for breeding. So very wet prairies intermixed with some upland prairie areas. And then for the wintering, these birds would shift down to the salt marsh areas, the cocoa marshes, with ignoring kind of the sawgrass and the thicker bulrush areas in between. All right, so that's what we kind of know about the distribution as well as the habitat areas. What were the numbers like? Well, we don't exactly know. We know that they were always likely rare. We know that they were probably never as numerous as whooping cranes. I've seen some estimates that during the Pleistocene, they may have ranged up to about 10,000 birds. We don't have good data as far as that goes. Allen, using some kill records as well as known nesting locations, kind of made this loose estimate of maybe there were just less than 1,500 birds in the 1860s. We really don't know. It's likely there were never huge flocks of whooping cranes like we would see with Santo cranes. What we do know for sure is that by 1940, there were about 22 individuals left. These were split mostly into the migratory population that was wintering in Texas with about 15 adults and 1 juvenile. And then there were 6 adults and young in Louisiana that were part of a non-migratory population. Louisiana population was lost during a hurricane just after this 1939 season. Most people kind of agree or hypothesize that they were killed off. There's some potential evidence that they may have actually gotten blown into the Texas population. We really don't know for sure. But we do know that by early 1940s, many of the marshes where whooping cranes had been found had gone silent. Why? Why did this happen? Well, there's kind of two main causes. We know that the biggest reason was likely habitat fragmentation, degradation, and loss. We know that wetlands were being tiled and also drained. And we know that prairies were being plowed under. Most of this was for human agriculture. A lot of this was post-Civil War. We're getting expansion of the population further west, outside of the Mississippi River. And so we know that people were looking for areas to grow food, and this is one of the biggest things that occurred during this time frame. This is a map. This was actually put together in 1950, but this shows the different drainage districts that were kind of championed by the federal government, starting as soon as statehood. So Ohio became a state in 1803, Indiana 1816, Illinois 1818, you got Michigan 1837, Iowa 1846, Wisconsin 1848, Minnesota 1858, and the Dakotas in 1889. And you can see kind of this westward march of settlers draining these wetlands, plowing up these areas for agriculture. And a lot of the red areas that you get into in Iowa, Minnesota, and the Dakotas, that was prime nesting habitat for whooping cranes. In addition to habitat loss, I'm going to let folks know that there is a picture of dead birds on this next slide. So I'm just making people aware. If you want to look away, I'll let you know when you can look back. But the other was unregulated harvest. A lot of this was market hunting. And then, so people were harvesting them for food. And then after that, as birds up on the right side of this slide, these are the kill records that were published in Allen. So these are all pre-1952. And you can see that a majority of them are on the kind of core area for whooping cranes. And there were about 313 birds reported as killed in Allen's analysis. Okay, you can look back if you looked away. So what happened? How did we conserve this species? So some of it is regulations in terms of federal government, in terms of the states. Regulations were put in place to protect migratory birds. The first of these was the Migratory Bird Treaty with Canada, which was signed in 1916. This morphed into the International Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918. And this was kind of one of the first quintessential acts. It basically said you cannot possess feathers, eggs, bones, any parts of a bird without permission from the government. And by working with Canada, we can kind of cross those international borders and protect species kind of throughout the northern 2/3 of North America. About 20 years later, the US signed the Migratory Bird and Game Mammal Treaty with Mexico. This kind of furthered protection of international species, so that pretty much all of North America was now covered to protect migratory birds as well as some of the mammals. This all worked really, really well. And then with the Endangered Species Act in 1973, this kind of was another key point in protection of whooping cranes. What the Endangered Species Act does is it defines endangered and threatened species, designates critical habitat, It defines the term take, which basically means harass, harm, pursue, hunt, shoot, wound, kill, trap, capture, or collect, or attempt to engage in any such conduct of threatened and endangered species. And what's really, really important is this includes significant habitat modification or degradation that impairs essential behavior patterns. This is key because it's not only protecting individual birds, which is what the Migratory Bird Treaty Act and the Migratory Bird and Game Mammal Act would did, but this protects habitat, and that is a key difference that has really been important. When the Endangered Species Act came out, whooping cranes were almost one of the first ones enlisted as endangered here in the United States. In terms of habitat protection, Aransas National Wildlife Refuge was established in 1937. This is the key wintering area where whooping cranes were returning year after year. It's owned and managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The original Aransas unit was just under 50,000 acres when it was established in the 30s. It's currently about 115,000 acres, so it's more than 2.5 times what it was at its first onset. And the goal is to expand it to at least 150,000 acres through continued federal protection. What's interesting is that there's currently in the works in the past couple of years a conservation partnership where they're trying to expand the overall protected area, not just of federal lands, but other important key players like the state of Texas, nonprofits, non-government, and I think they're even trying to work with some private landowners that have large tracts of land along the Gulf Coast. And the idea is to try and protect and preserve as much habitat within kind of this core area for the perpetual by a lot of different species. The breeding areas are in Wood Buffalo National Park. This was established in 1922. It's owned and managed by Parks Canada. And so if you remember, I just said that currently Aransas is about 115,000 acres. Wood Buffalo National Park is 11 million acres. It crosses the border in the provinces of Alberta and Northwest Territories. You can imagine why it was really hard to try and find out that that's where the whooping cranes were nesting. The nesting grounds were found in 1954, and they were actually found by accident when folks that were in a helicopter kind of mapping and fighting forest fires noticed a pair of whooping cranes with unfledged chicks running around on the ground. And this is the way that they discovered where the whooping crane's nesting ground was. So now they knew where the whooping crane nesting grounds were and had an idea of migratory stopover habitat. And so now we can start putting pieces into place to protect the entire cycle for whooping cranes. And one last kind of interesting note, in 1983, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, designated Wood Buffalo a World Heritage Site, primarily for its overall biodiversity, as well as its herd of wild wood bison. It's the most ecologically complete and largest example of Great Plains boreal grassland ecosystem found in North America. It's just an amazing place, and I really hope to get there someday. Additional conservation measures include stamps. A great way in the 40s and 50s to educate, to put the word out about endangered resources, endangered species. Canada started with a 5-cent stamp in 1955. United States followed not too long after in 50-cent stamp. And these were the kind of one of the first stamps that whooping cranes were found on, helped spread their word on their conservation. And others followed suit. The U.S. put out another stamp in the 1970s, as well as other countries like Burundi, the Cook Islands, as well as Haiti, that were celebrating the conservation of whooping cranes. The first whooping crane recovery plan was published in 1980. And it's important because it was set up these criteria for downlisting. So currently it's listed, the species is listed as endangered. To downlist it to threatened, to be certain criteria. The first of these is that the current natural population in wood buffalo and Aransas needs to have at least 40 nesting pair in their population. In addition, there need to be established 2 self-sustaining populations with at least 25 nesting pair. And these populations need to be declared experimental non-essential. What does that mean? Well, when you introduce birds or species onto the landscape, one way that you can get non-federal, non-state people interested and supportive is to remove that endangered designation. So for populations that are being put onto the landscape, they're not actually endangered species at that time. They are considered experimental, non-essential. So if one accidentally gets shot and killed or gets taken in another way, the fines, the punishment is less severe than if this were to happen in the natural population in wood buffalo or Aransas. It's an important designation, but I'll talk a little bit more about that as we get into the populations in just a bit. In captive breeding, there need to be at least 21 productive pairs. And then in terms of viability, all 3 self-sustaining populations need to be occurring for at least 10 years. The last whooping crane recovery plan was updated in 2007. This was agreed upon by US and Canada, and it set up this idea of alternative criteria. What if we can't get 3 self-sustaining populations? Well, if we get to 2, the wood buffalo Aransas population has to be at 400 with 100 productive pairs. An additional population of at least 120 individuals with 30 productive pairs, and they also need to be self-sustaining for a decade. If all the introductions fail, wood buffalo needs to be around 1,000 birds with 250 productive pairs. But what's interesting is that this was now an international recovery plan amongst Canada and the US, and they do start to put out stipulations for if Mexico gets involved, how would we integrate them into the overall protection for whooping cranes? So what's the current status? The wood buffalo Aransas population, it's the sole remnant flock. They have a 2,600-mile one-way migratory trip between their breeding grounds in wood buffalo and the wintering grounds in Aransas. The most recent population estimate is around 536 birds. And you're like, man, that's just not a lot. Well, considering in 1950 there were 34, this is a really good jump. And the population has done really well. There's been no manipulation of birds in this population in terms of introduction or bolstering this population. This is all growth that has occurred on its own. Humans have helped with habitat protection and those things, but it has all been natural growth. And you can kind of see the migratory pathway from northeastern Alberta down to the Gulf of Texas. This population has a fall staging area in southern Saskatchewan, which is about 525 miles from wood buffalo. They tend to stop for about 4 to 6 weeks. They rest, they refuel, the young get stronger, and then they continue on. Some of the threats at wood buffalo include oil sand mines. There are new oil sand mines within 30 kilometers of Wood Buffalo National Park. Hydroelectric dams are being developed on the Peace River, which is south of the park. There's water drainage for human consumption, and then the overall arching nemesis of climate change. And as the temperature warms and storms get more severe, how will whooping cranes deal with this? Threats at Aransas include oil and gas development. There's currently 7 active wells and greater than 80 inactive wells within the Aransas area. Energy development. There's a lot of potential wind energy development in the area, residential development, urban sprawl, and then invasive species like feral hogs, which can cause habitat destruction. In 2009, the Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as Environment Canada, joined together and started deploying radio tags on birds at Aransas and Wood Buffalo. They deployed 166 tags in 13 years. And the idea was not to learn more about the migratory flyway, but what are the threats that are going to be present in the migratory flyway? And one of the big things is wind development. So there's at least 5,500 turbines present in the migratory pathway. There's more than 18,000 turbines that are currently being planned. And this is a concern because the way that these birds fly is relatively slow. Going in and around wind turbines can be a real challenge. Migration is the highest source of mortality and throughout the annual cycle for whooping cranes. So these are concerns. But as we saw in the last graph, the population is actually doing quite well. In terms of captive management, prior to 1936, there were 13 whooping cranes located in captive institutions, as well as 3 present in Mexico. Many of these include the National Zoo, the New York City Zoo, as well as the New Orleans Zoo. The breeding program was started in 1966 in Patuxent Wildlife Research Center. This is located in Maryland and managed by the U.S. Geological Survey. The breeding program was started with eggs as well as 1 injured adult from Wood Buffalo National Park. And in 1989, the captive flock was split into 3 locations. This included Patuxent, the International Crane Foundation in Wisconsin, as well as Calgary Zoo in Alberta. Today, whooping cranes are found at 20 captive institutions, and 6 of those are breeding centers. So what are the things that we have learned from captive management? The first of these is imprinting. Imprinting is a big deal. This is a picture of George Archibald. He's one of the co-founders of the International Crane Foundation. And this is Tex. Tex is a female whooping crane. She was hatched at the San Antonio Zoo. She was raised by hand, and by that I mean she was actually fed from people's hands. And when she came to breeding age, she actually wouldn't pair with her mate, her nest or her pen mate Canis, and she would actually only display to human caretakers. So this was a problem, and they finally figured out that Tex was imprinted on people. So George, to get Tex to lay an egg, sat with her in a small little enclosure in her pen for months and months until she started laying eggs. And with the addition of artificial insemination, they were able to provide Tex with viable sperm, and so she could start laying viable eggs. Artificial insemination is really important because it allows fertilization by transferring sperm among pen mates if they're not naturally fertile. It allows them to transfer sperm among other individuals at the same institution. So you wouldn't have to keep moving birds around. And I said they form long-term pair bonds. And so breaking up a pair that's very good, but yet infertile would be a bad idea because they're strong socially. So you can just move gametes around, and this will help to raise the overall genetic diversity. And you can also ship it among institutions. And so you can, again, not have to move birds around. You can just move gametes. Puppet rearing was something that was developed in captive management to reduce the imprinting that occurred for birds that were hatched in captivity. They could focus on the head of their species, learn what they looked like, and focus on that. And so they knew that they were actually cranes. And then costume rearing. And so this is a step beyond puppet rearing, where costumes were used not necessarily to convince them that people were cranes, but it's to hide the human form. And so with the puppet in hand, they focus on learning what their species looks like. They are still wary of humans, but yet humans can be their caretakers, and these birds are able to be released into the wild. So how do we start new populations? Well, there's 2 main ways. There's reintroduction and there's translocation. Reintroduction is usually when captive bred individuals are released into an area where the species was formerly found but not found currently. Translocation is the movement of juveniles or adults from established populations into areas of suitable habitat. Oftentimes you want to release into the core area, but oftentimes you also want to keep populations separate. So if there's an environmental tragedy like an oil spill or a hurricane, you don't lose all of your population because it's in one spot. And then there's also the idea of soft release versus hard release. Soft release means that you acclimate birds to an area before you release them. Hard release is there's no acclimation period, and they found that birds have higher survival when you do a soft release. All right, so what are the reintroduction programs that have gone on with whooping cranes? First of these was they tried to start a migratory population. This started in 1975 at Gray's Lake National Wildlife Refuge in eastern Idaho. And they started this by actually cross-fostering. So what they did was they took whooping crane eggs and put them into sandhill crane nests. They knew that this could potentially be a problem, but the idea was, can we even start a migratory population? Let's see what happens. The birds were supposed to be raised at Gray's Lake, be led by their sandhill crane parents to New Mexico, where they would spend the winter. The Rocky Mountain population, from 1975 to 1989, they introduced 289 eggs in the population. Highest population size of whooping cranes in the area was 33 birds in 84 and 85. 15 years later, it had reduced down to 4 birds, and 2 years after that, it was down to a pair. So what did we learn? Well, we know that they learned the migration route. There were birds, moving from Idaho down to New Mexico. That's a good thing. Yeah, there was really high mortality, and the birds didn't think that they were whooping cranes. They thought they were sandhill cranes, and you would actually get hybridization of whooping cranes and sandhill cranes in the population. That's not good. We don't want that. All right, scratch that. Round 2. Let's see, can we start a non-migratory population? How would this work? Well, is migration learned or genetic? We kind of need to answer that question before we can actually figure out, can we start a non-migratory population? Because if you recall, genetically, all the whooping cranes that were left were from a migratory population. So we got to figure this out. So what they did is they tested this with sandhill cranes. They collected eggs from non-migratory sandhill crane, collected eggs from migratory sandhill crane populations, placed them in non-migratory sandhill crane nests in Florida, found that genetically migratory sandhill cranes did not migrate on their own. They actually didn't move any further than Florida sandhill cranes did anyway. It suggests that migration is actually a learned behavior. So when we look at Florida, for a non-migratory location, well, it's outside of the core area. As far as we know, there weren't any non-migratory populations in Florida ever. They didn't nest down there for sure. On the good side, it's kind of appropriate habitat, maybe. Well, and there's sandhill cranes there. They can learn some of the things from sandhill cranes. Let's give it a shot. So from 1993 to 2004, they released 289 captive raised whooping cranes into Central Florida. Unfortunately, the population became functionally extinct in 2008. Where some of these unexpected cons were, the biggest thing was drought. In the late 90s to early 2000s, there was extreme drought throughout the entire Central Florida region. There was just not enough rain, not enough good habitat. This opened up areas to human density, so the population growth in the 2000s into the 2010s and the 2020s. I mean, some of these percentages are, upwards of 20 to 30% human growth in many of these areas. You get a lot of baby boomers that are starting to retire. They are finding areas in order to winter or spend their entire life there, and just huge amount of population growth in terms of humans. And then the last thing were predators. Alligators would take whooping crane eggs when they found a nest. Bald eagles would take whooping crane young when they were not able to fly yet. And bobcats could actually take out adults. So a lot of these things kind of came together to kind of cease that population in 2008. All right. Can we start a migratory population? We learned that migration has to be taught. So how do you build a migratory population without adults to teach juveniles where and how to migrate? Well, they conducted lots of experiments with sandhill cranes. They tried releasing birds on the landscape, seeing where they went. They tried releasing birds into flocks, seeing could they get integrated. Can we teach them as humans how to migrate? How would that work? Well, they tried flying them behind. They banded them so they could follow the individual birds, so they knew where they would go. They tried flying them behind a truck. That didn't work very well. The birds weren't flying like they would normally, and they just weren't conditioned well to fly in that particular manner. Well, how's this going to work? Well, before we get to that, there was actually really an unexpected migration. This was a lot of fun. I got to help with this particular situation. There was a pair of whooping cranes in Florida. They said, heck with this, in 2000, we're out of here, and they left. And they flew up to Southern Illinois, spent 5 days in Sandoval, Illinois, and then disappeared. And then they settled in the thumb of Michigan, spent the summer there. Like, this is kind of cool. What are they going to do when it gets cold? Well, they did exactly what we expected them to do. They took off. Along with a lot of sandhill cranes, left the area right before a snowstorm. The female had a functional transmitter on her, so we could actually radio track her. We followed her to the north shore of Lake Erie, where we had to land in the plane because the weather started getting really bad. South of Lake Erie, we picked up the female's transmitter again. We actually got her in view, and it was just her. The male wasn't there. We think, unfortunately, he landed probably at the bottom of Lake Erie. We never saw him again, but we tracked the female. We followed her all the way down, and you can see on this map on the right that she followed a straight line back to Florida. The only time she deviated from that line is when she hit the Appalachians in Western Virginia. She had to hit a mountain pass and went southwest, jogged around for a little bit, stopped over in eastern Tennessee. She rested for a couple of days in a cow pasture, eating insects and other bugs to get more protein. Made it through the mountain pass, went into South Carolina, and then look at this. She went back to her line. She went back to her straight line in southeastern Georgia. And then by the time she got to Okefenokee Swamp in southern Georgia, she started deviating from her line back to her home range with her mate down in Inverness. And when she landed, she waited for a day. The male didn't show up. She went back to her original hatch, or what she considered her hatch location, or her fledgling location in Central Florida, where she was released as a chick before that. Really, really fascinating, cool stuff. Nobody taught these guys how to migrate, and yet they were showing the exact migration behaviors we would expect for a natural population. She did everything that she was supposed to do as far as a migrating bird, but nobody taught her how to migrate. Really, really cool stuff. But that won't work for a population. So to do that, we need to start with something that can fly with the birds. Well, this enters Operation Migration, the use of ultralight aircraft. If you've heard of the movie Fly Away Home, where the people taught geese to fly behind their ultralight, this is the exact same group. They started working with sandhill cranes in 2000, started working with whooping cranes in 2001. The challenge with flying behind an ultralight is they can't fly very far. This is all flap flying. They're flying behind the wings of the plane. They have to fly when the conditions are right, very low wind, very low humidity. So they would oftentimes only fly 20 miles, and that's as far as they would get in a day. They might get up to 200 miles. That was the longest stretch of any of the years that they did this. So it wasn't really natural migration behavior, but we hoped that they would at least learn the route. So in addition to flying behind ultralight, they did what's called direct autumn release, where they released flocks of birds, of young birds into flocks of adult whooping cranes that were on the landscape once the population got big enough. And they also parent reared single and siblings of birds in captivity. Those were raised, and then those were also released into wild population. And so a friend and colleague of mine, Hillary Thompson, did some analysis in 2022, looking at all the different release methods, all the different things. How did they pair up against each other in terms of survival? And basically found that there really wasn't a whole lot of difference in terms of first-year survival and third-year survival. Parent-reared had the lowest survival. Ultralight kind of had the highest, but they're all kind of similar to each other. And so in addition, she kind of looked at wild birds, and wild birds that were fledging in the population on the landscape were about the same. So this population is still kind of growing. It's not necessarily self-sustaining yet. There's about 76 birds and 24 pairs. So we haven't met that criteria yet as a single self-sustaining population. But what's also interesting is that Hillary posted where the locations of where the whooping cranes were at on the landscape. And all the white dots on the left-hand map were all known nesting birds. And you can see they spread out throughout entire central Wisconsin, went into northwestern Wisconsin. There was also a pair that nested in Michigan. And then birds that had not yet started to breed ranged everywhere from the Dakotas down to southern Illinois and into Kentucky. So the birds are kind of expanding and growing kind of on their own. Similarly, if you look at the wintering locations, birds are wintering as far north as Wisconsin during a mild winter. They're spreading out using some of the historic wintering areas like the Gulf Coast of the Carolinas down into Louisiana area, but most of the birds are flying between central Wisconsin and Florida, which is where the ultralights would lead them from one area to the next. Some of the challenges include wayward birds. So birds, you might have heard just a couple of years ago, a bird ended up in the suburbs of Chicago. They had to go catch up the bird by wearing a costume, kind of lure it into a soft capture area, and then pick it up, transport it back to where it was going to be safe. There's a lot of learning from Santo cranes, which can be a good thing, but Santo cranes also damage crops. Maybe that's not such a good thing. And unfortunately, we're still actually getting hybridization. These birds were raised correctly using the puppet rearing method, but a couple birds said, hey, that sandhill looks pretty good. I'm going to pair with that bird instead. So it's not a perfect system, but in general, it's working relatively well. All right, last round. So can we start a different non-migratory population? And can we actually put it in an area where whooping cranes were found historically? So they settled on White Lake, Louisiana, started releasing birds in 2011. There's been over 160 birds released in the past 14 years. They've also picked up some of the birds that were kind of dwindling in Florida and moved them over to Louisiana. Those birds have actually done quite well. Most of them have started to pair with adults in the population. And there's currently 81 birds and 19 pairs. So again, not yet self-sustaining, but getting closer. And these birds nested about 5 years after releases started. And so you can see non-migratory wise, they've kind of distributed themselves throughout Louisiana, wandered into Texas, but they're not really migrating on their own. They're kind of sticking to the area where they're supposed to. All right, so there's about 700 wild or released birds on the landscape. You can see they're in primarily 3 main populations between Wood Buffalo National Park, Aransas, the non-migratory population in Louisiana, and then the migratory population in Wisconsin and Florida. There's about 160 captive birds, so that criteria has kind of been met. But what does the future hold? Well, unfortunately, Operation Migration disbanded for a variety of reasons in 2016. So can we get a migratory population started? Could we drop birds somewhere along the flyway of the Wood Buffalo Aransas flock? It's within the historic range of whooping cranes. But they're interacting directly with Wood Buffalo Aransas, and we try to keep them separate. Well, the next question might be, well, is there actually habitat? Well, the tallgrass prairie in the prairie pothole region has been a lot of habitat loss since the 1800s. 90% of the wetlands have been drained for agriculture. Almost 80% of the prairies have been plowed under. And you can see the light green area is what would historically have been the tallgrass prairie. Dark green areas are where prairie is still present. Not a lot of prairie present still. And when you look at wetland and prairie loss within these states, you're looking at pretty high numbers. The top numbers are wetland loss, the bottom numbers are prairie loss. There's some good areas in the Dakotas. And when you look at some of the prairie potholes that are still present, it kind of looks like decent habitat. There's a couple good spots in Iowa. They're not very big, about 1,000 acres to 1,500 acres. Does enough for Maine? Can it be protected at all? Can you work with private landowners? Maybe see if you can get them to house pairs on their proper property. I don't know. There's a lot of speculation about how we can maybe get another population going if that's a goal. Could Mexico serve as a wintering area? There's over 230 important bird areas found within Mexico. And what's interesting is you look at this map, Bolson de Mapimi, Laguna Madre, Chapala's Lagoon, La Barca, these are all areas where whooping cranes were found wintering historically. A lot of these are important bird areas. Is the hydrology stable enough? I don't know. It'd be really cool to get some populations going wintering down in Mexico again. A lot needs to be seen, and a lot needs to be studied before we can really kind of dig into if there's a need for another population. So we'll see. All right, with that, I thank you, and I'll take any questions that you guys have.
So again, put your questions in the chat and I will kind of mesh them in together and read them out loud. Gail Taxi said goodbye already, so I think it's a moot point, but her grandson was asking, where do you find the tufted cranes?
The crown cranes, yes, those are found in Africa. So there's black crown crane and gray crown crane, and they're both species are found in Africa. Yep.
Okay. And then kind of going backwards a little bit, Deborah Allen asked, could drones or have drones been used to help the whooping cranes migrate?
That's an interesting question. When they were doing a lot of this, drones were not really part of available technology. They had to get the birds to imprint on the noise of the ultralight while they were still in the egg. So you could probably do that with a drone. It's an interesting idea. It's definitely not out of the realm of possibility. I like that idea.
And then Vera Leopold asked, what conservation measures do you think have been the biggest factors in boosting the wood buffalo aransas population?
Habitat preservation, definitely. I mean, you got to get people to stop shooting birds, and that was definitely the result of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. But without habitat preservation, you can have all the birds out there, but if they don't have anywhere to live, it's not going to do any good. So I would argue habitat preservation has definitely been the key.
And I was a speaker out in Nebraska several years ago and chatted with one of the people who was responsible for those maps that you showed. I forget her name, but she said we don't have to protect, 1,000-mile route. We know which wetlands they're stopping at, and if we could just protect those spots along the map, which your map showed beautifully. Thank you for that, Matt.
100%.
And then we have a bunch of thank yous coming in, but Ellen Gorski asked a very important and straight up question. What can we do to help whooping crane populations?
I think that's a great question. If you can report, if you observe birds, report them to the International Crane Foundation. There's an area where you can report sightings of banded birds. Get out there, talk to your friends, talk to your neighbors. Visit areas like Jasper Pulaski and Hiawassee Wildlife Refuge. Help support the areas where these cranes will migrate through, spend the winter. Give to groups like the International Crane Foundation to help to support their work for continuing to conserve these guys. Oh, you're muted, Brian.
Yes. Thank you. Several more thank yous have come in. One last question, anyone? good night, everyone. Thanks again to Matt for a great program. I learned some things.
Absolutely.
And thank you to Will County Audubon.